The dust kicked up from the wagon wheels as Sheriff Martinez pulled the iron-barred prison cart through the main street of Copper Ridge. Inside the cage, Ayanna sat with her wrists bound in heavy shackles, her dark eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to witness her arrival. The Apache woman held her head high despite the chains, her weathered buckskin dress telling stories of a life lived free among the mesas and canyons of the Arizona Territory. Word had spread quickly through the small frontier town that they were bringing in the woman accused of stealing cattle from the Morrison Ranch. The townspeople lined the dusty street, some pointing and whispering, others shouting accusations. Children pressed their faces between adult legs to get a better look at the savage their parents spoke about in hushed tones. "There she is," called out Mrs. Henderson from the general store steps. "The one who's been causing all the trouble." Her voice carried the weight of fear and prejudice that had settled over the town like a heavy blanket. Ayanna understood enough English to know what they were saying, but she remained silent. She had learned long ago that words meant little to people who had already made up their minds. The wagon lurched to a stop in front of the jailhouse, a small adobe building with barred windows that looked more like a tomb than a place of justice. Sheriff Martinez, a weathered man in his 50s with graying hair beneath his worn hat, climbed down from the driver's seat. He had made this journey many times before, but something about this particular prisoner troubled him. During the 3-day ride from the territorial capital, the Apache woman had not spoken a single word of complaint despite the rough roads and meager food. She had dignity that many of the white criminals he transported lacked. "All right, folks, move along," Martinez called to the crowd. "Nothing more to see here." But the people lingered, their curiosity and suspicion keeping them rooted to the spot. As Martinez unlocked the cage door, Ayanna stepped out slowly. The chains around her ankles made it difficult to walk with her usual grace, but she managed to maintain her composure. The sheriff noticed how she moved carefully, not wanting to stumble and give the crowd any reason to mock her further. Among the faces in the crowd, 2 young women stood apart from the rest. Sarah and Emma Coleman, daughters of rancher Jack Coleman, watched with different expressions than their neighbors. Where others showed hatred or fear, the sisters displayed something closer to concern and curiosity. Sarah, the elder at 22, had always questioned the stories told about the Apache people. Emma, 19 and more impulsive than her sister, felt an immediate sympathy for the chained woman. "Look how they're treating her," Emma whispered to her sister. "Like she's some kind of wild animal." Sarah nodded quietly, noticing how Ayanna's eyes swept across the crowd without showing fear. "She doesn't look like someone who would steal cattle," Sarah replied, keeping her voice low so their father wouldn't hear. Jack Coleman stood nearby, his face set in hard lines. As one of the most successful ranchers in the territory, he had lost several head of cattle over the past months. When word came that they had caught an Apache woman with stolen beef, he felt a grim satisfaction. Justice would finally be served. "About time they caught one of them," Jack muttered to his neighbor, Tom Bradley. "Maybe now they'll think twice before raiding our herds." But his daughters exchanged worried glances. They had grown up hearing their mother's stories before she died, tales of how the Apache people had once lived peacefully in these lands before the settlers arrived. Their mother, Mary Coleman, had been one of the few white women who tried to understand the native peoples rather than fear them. Sheriff Martinez guided Ayanna into the jailhouse, past the curious stares and hostile murmurs. Inside the dim building, Deputy Frank Morrison waited with the cell keys. Frank was the nephew of the rancher whose cattle had allegedly been stolen, and his face showed none of the sheriff's professional restraint. "So this is the cow thief," Frank said with obvious disdain. "Doesn't look like much, does she?" "Just do your job, Morrison," the sheriff replied curtly. He had worked with Frank for 2 years and had grown tired of the young man's prejudices. "Get her settled in the cell and make sure she has water and food." The cell was small and cramped, with a single barred window that let in a narrow beam of afternoon sunlight. A wooden cot with a thin mattress and a bucket for water completed the sparse furnishings. As Martinez removed the ankle chains, he spoke quietly to Ayanna in the few Apache words he had picked up over the years. "Water," he said, pointing to the bucket. "Food," he added, gesturing toward the door where meals would be brought. Ayanna looked at him with surprise. Few white men bothered to learn even basic words in her language. She nodded once in acknowledgement, the first real communication she had offered since her capture. After the sheriff left, Ayanna sat on the narrow cot and, finally, allowed herself to show some of the exhaustion she felt. 3 days of being bounced around in the prison wagon, eating stale bread and drinking warm water, had taken its toll. But, more than physical discomfort, she felt the weight of injustice pressing down on her. She had not stolen any cattle. On the night in question, she had been gathering medicinal plants in the hills east of the Morrison Ranch, far from where the theft supposedly occurred. But, who would believe the word of an Apache woman against that of white ranchers? Ayanna thought of her younger brother, Nailnish, who was probably worried sick about her disappearance. They had been living peacefully in a small camp with a few other Apache families, trying to survive on the increasingly limited land they were allowed to occupy. The buffalo were nearly gone, the streams had been diverted for white settlements, and opportunities to hunt or gather food grew scarcer each year. Outside her cell window, she could hear the town settling into its evening routine. Horses clattered past on their way to the livery stable, children called to each other in the street, and the sounds of normal life continued as if nothing had changed. But, for Ayanna, everything had changed. She faced a trial that would likely end in a long prison sentence or worse. As darkness fell, Deputy Morrison brought her a plate of beans and a piece of hard bread. He set it on the floor and pushed it through the bars without making eye contact. The gesture was meant to be demeaning, treating her like an animal in a zoo, but Ayanna simply picked up the plate and began to eat. She had survived worse treatment and would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her pride broken. Late that night, after the town had grown quiet, Ayanna heard soft footsteps outside the jailhouse. Through her small window, she could see 2 figures moving carefully in the shadows. The Coleman sisters had returned, drawn by a curiosity they couldn't shake. Sarah carried a small basket covered with a cloth, while Emma kept watch for any sign of the sheriff or deputy. They had spent the evening arguing with their father about the Apache woman's fate, but Jack Coleman remained convinced of her guilt. The sisters, however, had decided to see for themselves what kind of person had been locked away. "Hello," Sarah called softly through the barred window. "Can you understand English?" Ayanna moved to the window, surprised to see the 2 young women who had watched her arrival with such different expressions from the rest of the crowd. She nodded slowly. "We brought you some food," Emma said, holding up a cloth bundle. "Real food, not whatever slop they're giving you." Sarah carefully passed a warm biscuit and some dried fruit through the bars. "We don't think you stole those cattle," she whispered. "Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right." For the first time since her capture, Ayanna felt a spark of hope. These young women were willing to look beyond the surface, to see her as a person rather than just an Apache to be feared. She accepted the food gratefully and spoke her first English words in days. "Thank you," she said quietly, her accent thick but her meaning clear. Emma smiled. "What's your name?" "Ayanna," came the soft reply. "I'm Emma, and this is my sister Sarah. We're going to help you somehow." Sarah quickly hushed her sister, glancing around nervously. "We should go before someone sees us." But, as they prepared to leave, Ayanna spoke again. "I not take cattle. I gather medicine plants in hills. For sick child in camp." The sisters exchanged meaningful looks. This was exactly what they had suspected. The woman before them showed no signs of deception, and her explanation made more sense than the story they had heard about Apache raiders. "We believe you," Sarah said firmly. "And we're going to prove your innocence." As the sisters slipped away into the darkness, Ayanna felt something she hadn't experienced since her capture, the possibility that justice might actually prevail. She settled onto her cot, clutching the warm biscuit, and allowed herself to hope that these brave young women might be the key to her freedom. The night passed slowly, filled with the sounds of coyotes calling in the distance and the occasional snore from Deputy Morrison, who slept in a chair near the front door. But Ayanna's dreams were no longer filled with despair. Instead, she dreamed of the hills where she had been gathering medicine plants, and of the sick child who might still need her healing knowledge. Tomorrow would bring the preliminary hearing, where the charges against her would be formally presented. But tonight, for the first time since her arrest, Ayanna fell asleep with the belief that truth might find a way to shine through the darkness of prejudice and fear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as people began gathering outside the courthouse for Ayanna's preliminary hearing. Judge William Harrison had arrived from the county seat the previous evening, bringing with him a reputation for fairness that some appreciated and others found inconvenient when dealing with Apache defendants. Sarah and Emma Coleman sat on the courthouse steps, having arrived early to secure good seats inside. They had spent a sleepless night discussing what they had learned from their conversation with Ayanna and planning how they might help prove her innocence. Their father had forbidden them from getting involved, but the sisters had made a pact to follow their mother's teaching about standing up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. "There has to be someone who saw her that night," Sarah said, adjusting her blue cotton dress and checking the small notebook she had brought to record details of the hearing. "If she was really gathering plants in the hills, maybe one of the other Apache families knows about it." Emma nodded, her green eyes bright with determination. "Or maybe someone from town saw her there. You know how Mrs. Peterson likes to walk her dogs up toward the hills in the evening." Inside the jailhouse, Sheriff Martinez was preparing Ayanna for the hearing. He had noticed the improvement in her mood since the previous evening and wondered what had caused the change. The Apache woman seemed more alert, more hopeful, though she still maintained the dignified silence that had marked her captivity. "Time to go," Martinez said gently, holding up the lighter chains that would replace the heavy shackles for the court appearance. Judge Harrison had sent word that the defendant should be treated with basic human dignity during legal proceedings, a directive that didn't sit well with some of the townspeople but which the sheriff appreciated. As they walked the short distance from the jailhouse to the courthouse, Ayanna noticed the size of the crowd that had gathered. It seemed like half the town had turned out to witness her hearing. Some faces showed mere curiosity, others displayed open hostility, but she also spotted a few expressions of sympathy and doubt. The Coleman sisters caught her eye and offered encouraging smiles that helped steady her nerves. The courthouse was a simple wooden building with high windows and rows of wooden benches that were now packed with spectators. Judge Harrison, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, sat behind a raised desk at the front of the room. His black robes and serious demeanor commanded immediate respect from the assembled crowd. Prosecutor James Whitman, a thin man in his 40s with a carefully waxed mustache, shuffled through his papers at a table near the front. He had handled dozens of cases involving Apache defendants and had built his reputation on successful convictions. Across from him sat a simple wooden chair where Ayanna would stand trial without legal representation, as was common for Native American defendants in territorial courts. "All rise," called the bailiff, a burly man named Pete Sullivan. The Honorable Judge William Harrison presiding. The crowd rose to its feet as Judge Harrison took his place. His eyes swept across the packed courtroom, taking note of the unusual level of interest in what should have been a routine preliminary hearing. He had read the case files during his journey to Copper Ridge and had found the evidence against the defendant surprisingly thin. "You may be seated," Judge Harrison announced. "This court is now in session for the preliminary hearing in the case of the Territory versus Ayanna, charged with cattle theft." Prosecutor Whitman stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the Territory will prove that the defendant, an Apache woman of approximately 25 years, did willfully and unlawfully steal 3 head of cattle from the Morrison Ranch on the evening of September 15. As Whitman began outlining his case, Ayanna listened carefully to every word. Her English was better than most people realized, a skill she had developed through trading with Mexican and American settlers before tensions had made such interactions dangerous. She understood that her fate hung on the words being spoken in this room. "The evidence will show," Whitman continued, "that Apache raiders have been systematically stealing livestock from honest, hard-working ranchers throughout this territory. The defendant was found in possession of freshly butchered beef that has been identified as coming from Morrison cattle." A murmur went through the crowd at this statement, but Judge Harrison noticed something that others missed. The defendant's face showed genuine surprise at this claim, not the look of someone whose guilt had been discovered. "Mr. Whitman," the judge interrupted, "you say the defendant was found with stolen beef. Where exactly was she apprehended, and by whom?" The prosecutor shuffled through his papers, looking slightly uncomfortable. The arrest was made by a posse led by rancher Tom Bradley, approximately 15 miles southwest of the Morrison Ranch. Judge Harrison made a note. And this was how many days after the alleged theft? 3 days, Your Honor. I see. Continue with your presentation. In the gallery, Sarah Coleman was furiously scribbling notes in her small book. The timeline didn't make sense to her. If cattle had been stolen from the Morrison Ranch, why would Ayanna be found so far away with the evidence 3 days later? Any experienced thief would have disposed of such obvious proof of guilt long before then. Whitman called his first witness, rancher Bob Morrison, whose cattle had allegedly been stolen. Morrison was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a red face and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. He approached the witness stand with obvious anger, glaring at Ayanna as he passed. Mr. Morrison, Whitman began, please tell the court about the events of September 15th. Well, Morrison started, his voice loud enough to reach the back of the courtroom. I was doing my evening check of the herd when I noticed 3 of my best steers were missing. These weren't just any cattle, mind you. They were prize animals I'd been raising for breeding. How can you be certain they were stolen rather than simply wandering off? Morrison snorted. Cattle don't just wander off in perfect weather with good grass and water nearby. Besides, I found Apache moccasin prints near where they'd been grazing. Judge Harrison leaned forward. Mr. Morrison, are you qualified to identify Apache footprints as distinct from those of other tribes or even Mexican vaqueros? The question caught Morrison off guard. Well, they look like Indian prints to me. I see. Continue, Mr. Whitman. Emma Coleman nudged her sister, noticing how the judge's questions were poking holes in what seemed like a straightforward case. Maybe there was hope for Ayanna after all. The next witness was Tom Bradley, the rancher who had led the posse that captured Ayanna. Bradley was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and a reputation for harboring strong prejudices against the Apache people. He had been one of the most vocal advocates for forcing all Native Americans out of the territory entirely. Mr. Bradley, Whitman continued, please describe how you came to arrest the defendant. Bradley's voice carried the confidence of a man who believed completely in his own righteousness. 3 days after Morrison's cattle went missing, I was leading a search party through the hills southwest of his ranch. We followed Apache tracks for most of 2 days before we found their camp. And what did you discover there? The defendant was roasting fresh beef over an open fire. When we got closer, we could see the Morrison brand clear as day on the hide that was stretched out to dry. This testimony caused a stir in the courtroom, and several people nodded as if the case was now proven beyond doubt. But Judge Harrison had more questions. Mr. Bradley, how many Apache people were in this camp? Just the woman and her brother, plus 2 older folks and some children. And did you find any cattle with this group? Bradley hesitated. No live cattle, but, like I said, they had the butchered meat. I see. And what did the defendant say when you accused her of theft? She claimed she'd found the dead steer in a canyon and was just salvaging the meat. Said her people were hungry. Bradley's tone made it clear he didn't believe a word of Ayanna's explanation. Judge Harrison made another note. Did you investigate this canyon to verify her claim? Didn't see the need. Apache word isn't worth much against physical evidence. The judge's expression hardened slightly at this response, but he simply instructed Whitman to continue. In the back of the courtroom, Sarah was writing furiously. The story was becoming clearer, but it wasn't the story the prosecution wanted to tell. If Ayanna's group had been surviving on salvaged meat from a dead animal, it suggested desperation rather than criminal intent. And the fact that they had been openly cooking the meat rather than hiding it didn't fit the pattern of guilty thieves. The final witness was Deputy Frank Morrison, the nephew of the alleged victim. His testimony focused on the arrest itself and the defendant's behavior during transport. Frank described Ayanna as sullen and uncooperative, though Sheriff Martinez, sitting in the front row, remembered her behavior quite differently. The defendant refused to answer questions about where the other stolen cattle might be hidden, Frank testified. Typical Apache stubbornness. Judge Harrison had heard enough.
Mr. Whitman, do you have any other evidence to present? No, Your Honor. The territory believes the evidence clearly shows the defendant's guilt. Very well. Does the defendant wish to make any statement? This was the moment Ayanna had been waiting for. She stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, though heavily accented. Honorable Judge, she began, I not steal cattle. I find dead steer in canyon, shot by someone. Maybe hurt, maybe sick. I take meat to feed hungry children in camp. We have little food. Winter coming. The courtroom was completely silent as she continued. I gather medicine plants in hills that night. For sick child in next camp. I know plants that help fever. This is true thing. Judge Harrison studied her face carefully. You say you found the steer already dead. Can you describe this canyon? Ayanna nodded eagerly. Yes. Canyon with red rocks, maybe half-day walk from Morrison Land. Has small water, good plants grow there. I can show. And, you were gathering medicinal plants on the night the cattle allegedly disappeared? Yes. Child very sick with fever. I look for white bark tree, make medicine. From the gallery, Sarah Coleman felt her heart racing. This was exactly what they had suspected. Ayanna had been on a mercy mission, not a cattle raid. But, would anyone believe her? Judge Harrison looked around the courtroom, his gaze settling on the Coleman sisters, who were watching intently. He noticed their obvious sympathy for the defendant and wondered what they might know about the situation. This court will recess for 1 hour, he announced. When we reconvene, I will render my decision on whether there is sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Sarah and Emma hurried toward the front, hoping to speak with the judge or sheriff. They had an idea that might help prove Ayanna's innocence, but they would need help from someone in authority. Sheriff Martinez was speaking quietly with Judge Harrison when the sisters approached. Excuse me, Your Honor, Sarah said respectfully, but we have information that might be relevant to this case. The judge raised an eyebrow. And, you are? Sarah and Emma Coleman, sir. Our father owns the ranch adjacent to Morrison's land. What information do you have, Miss Coleman? Sarah took a deep breath. We know the canyon the defendant described. And, we know she's telling the truth about gathering medicinal plants. Our mother used to gather from the same area, and she taught us which plants the Apache use for healing. Emma stepped forward. More importantly, Your Honor, we think we know who really shot that steer. The judge's interest was clearly piqued. Go on. There's been a problem with wild dogs in that area, Sarah explained. They've been attacking livestock, and some of the ranchers have been shooting cattle they found wounded rather than trying to save them. If someone shot a steer and left it, that would explain why Ayanna found it dead in the canyon. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. That's an interesting theory, Miss Coleman. Do you have any evidence to support it? The sisters exchanged glances. This was their gamble. We'd like permission to examine the canyon where the defendant says she found the steer. If there are bullet holes in the rocks or other evidence of a shooting, it might prove her story. And, you're willing to testify to your findings? Yes, sir, both sisters said in unison. Judge Harrison looked at Sheriff Martinez. Sheriff, would you be willing to escort these young ladies to investigate this canyon? Martinez nodded. I think it's worth looking into, Your Honor. Very well. This hearing is postponed until tomorrow morning to allow for this investigation. Sheriff Martinez, please make arrangements for Miss Coleman and her sister to examine the alleged scene. As people began to disperse, Ayanna felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. These brave young women were risking their reputations and, possibly their safety to help her. But, would their investigation reveal enough evidence to prove her innocence, or would she still face trial and certain conviction? The next few hours would determine whether justice truly was possible in Copper Ridge, or whether prejudice and fear would triumph once again.
The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Sheriff Martinez led Sarah and Emma Coleman toward the Red Rock Canyon that Ayanna had described. They rode in the sheriff's wagon, with Ayanna sitting between the sisters, her hands still bound but the heavy leg irons removed for the journey. The Apache woman had insisted on coming along to guide them to the exact location, and Judge Harrison had agreed after much deliberation. "It should be just over that ridge," Ayanna said, pointing toward a cluster of towering red sandstone formations. Her voice carried a mixture of hope and anxiety, knowing that what they found in the canyon could mean the difference between freedom and years in territorial prison. Emma studied Ayanna's face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she carefully observed every detail of the landscape around them. This was clearly a woman who knew the land intimately, someone who could navigate these harsh canyons and mesas as easily as the townspeople walked down Main Street. "Tell us about the medicinal plants you were gathering," Sarah said, genuinely curious about the traditional healing knowledge that her mother had only briefly explained to her years earlier. Ayanna's expression softened. "The white bark tree, what you call willow, grows near water in canyon. Make tea from bark, help with fever and pain. Child in next camp, maybe 5 years old, burning with sickness. Her grandmother asked me to find medicine." Sheriff Martinez listened to this explanation with interest. In his 20 years of law enforcement in the territory, he had learned to distinguish between truth and deception, and everything about Ayanna's demeanor suggested honesty. Her story was detailed and consistent, and she showed genuine concern for the sick child rather than trying to craft an elaborate excuse for her supposed crime. "How did you learn about these medicines?" Emma asked. "My grandmother teach me, her grandmother teach her. Knowledge passed from woman to woman for many generations. We know which plants heal, which hurt, which bring strength when food is scarce." As they crested the ridge, a breathtaking canyon spread out below them. Red rock walls rose on either side, carved by centuries of wind and flash floods into fantastic shapes and patterns. A thin stream meandered through the canyon floor, creating patches of green vegetation that stood out vividly against the russet landscape. "There," Ayanna said, pointing to a wide area near the stream. "Where I find the dead cow." Sheriff Martinez guided the horses down a rocky slope that served as a natural trail into the canyon. The going was rough, and he had to admire Ayanna's skill at navigating such terrain on foot. It would have taken considerable knowledge of the area to find this place, especially in the dark while searching for specific plants. They reached the canyon floor and climbed down from the wagon. The air was cooler here, sheltered from the direct sun by the high walls, and the sound of trickling water provided a peaceful contrast to the tensions that had brought them together. "Show us exactly where you found the animal," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook to record their findings. Ayanna led them to a flat area near the stream where the grass grew thick and green. "Here," she said, kneeling down and pointing to a patch of disturbed earth. "Cow was lying here, already dead maybe 1 day." Emma knelt beside her and examined the ground. Even days later, she could see signs of where a large animal had lain. The grass was flattened and discolored, and there were still traces of dried blood on some of the rocks. Sheriff Martinez walked in a wide circle around the area, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. "If the animal was shot, there should be evidence somewhere nearby," he murmured, scanning the canyon walls and surrounding rocks. "Look for bullet marks in stone," Ayanna suggested. "When men shoot, bullets sometimes hit rock after." This practical observation impressed the sheriff, who realized that Ayanna had probably witnessed the aftermath of gunfights and hunting accidents throughout her life. Her suggestion made perfect sense, and he began examining the rock faces more carefully. Sarah was studying the vegetation near the stream, recognizing some of the plants her mother had shown her years earlier. "These are the willow trees you mentioned," she called to Ayanna. "And I can see where bark has been stripped from some of the branches." Ayanna joined her and pointed to the specific trees where she had gathered bark. "Cut here and here. Take only what needed, leave tree healthy for next time." The evidence was mounting to support Ayanna's version of events, but they still needed proof that the steer had been shot rather than stolen and butchered. Emma was examining the rocky slopes when she suddenly called out in excitement. "Sheriff! Over here!" Martinez hurried to where Emma was pointing at a large boulder about 30 yards from where the animal had been found. There, clearly visible in the red sandstone, was a fresh bullet gouge surrounded by spider web cracks in the rock. "Well, I'll be damned," the sheriff muttered, then caught himself and apologized to the ladies for his language.
Someone definitely fired a rifle in this direction. Sarah joined them and examined the bullet mark carefully.
"Look at the angle," she said, pointing from the gouge back toward where they had found the bloodstains. "If someone was shooting from up on that ridge, trying to put a wounded animal out of its misery, this is exactly where a bullet would hit if it passed through the steer." Emma was already scrambling up the rocky slope toward the ridge, her adventurous nature overriding her sister's more cautious approach. "If someone shot from up there might be more evidence," she called down.
Sheriff Martinez followed Emma up the slope, while Sarah stayed below with Ayanna.
The Apache woman watched the investigation with growing hope but also with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust in justice too quickly.
"Your mother teach you about healing plants too?" Ayanna asked Sarah while they waited. Sarah nodded.
"Some, but not nearly as much as I wish she had. She died when Emma and I were still young, and our father doesn't approve of what he calls Indian medicine."
"Your mother was wise woman. Plants know how to heal if people know how to ask them."
On the ridge above, Emma had made another discovery. "Sheriff, look at this," she called excitedly.
Martinez climbed up to where she was kneeling beside a flat rock that provided a perfect vantage point over the canyon.
On the ground nearby, he could see the depression where someone had lain prone to take a shot, and scattered around the area were several brass cartridge cases from a rifle. Someone was definitely shooting from up here, Martinez confirmed, picking up one of the brass cases and examining it. "These are from a Winchester repeating rifle, probably .44-40 caliber."
Emma was studying the view from the shooting position.
"You can see the whole canyon from here, including where the steer was found."
"But, Sheriff, look how far it is."
"This would be a very difficult shot for anyone but an experienced marksman."
Martinez nodded grimly.
"Most of the ranchers around here are good shots, but this kind of precision shooting, that narrows down the possibilities quite a bit." When they climbed back down to share their findings, Sarah was deep in conversation with Ayanna about the various plants growing along the stream. The two women had found an unexpected common ground in their shared interest in the healing properties of nature.
"We found evidence of shooting from the ridge," Martinez announced.
"Multiple rifle cartridges and a clear firing position overlooking this area."
"So Ayanna was telling the truth," Sarah said with obvious relief.
"She found the steer already dead, shot by someone else." But the sheriff's expression remained troubled. "That proves she didn't steal the animal, but it raises new questions. Who shot the steer, and why did they leave it here instead of taking the meat themselves?"
Emma had been thinking about the same question.
Maybe they thought it was too badly injured to be worth saving, but didn't want to leave a suffering animal. Some ranchers will shoot rather than try to doctor a badly hurt steer.
Ayanna spoke up quietly.
"Animal was shot in neck, clean through.
Quick death, no suffering. Whoever shoot knows animals well."
This detail sent a chill through the group. If the steer had been shot professionally, it suggested someone with experience in handling livestock, which could describe any number of local ranchers. As they prepared to return to town with their evidence, Sheriff Martinez found himself wrestling with uncomfortable questions. The bullet casings and shooting position proved that Ayanna hadn't stolen the cattle, but they also suggested that someone else was involved in the animal's death. Whether that person was trying to end the animal's suffering or had other motives remained unclear. "We need to get back and report these findings to Judge Harrison," Martinez said, helping the women back into the wagon. "But I want to ask you all to keep the details of what we found quiet until after tomorrow's hearing. If word gets out that we're investigating other possibilities, it might complicate things."
Sarah nodded, understanding the delicate politics involved.
"Of course, Sheriff.
We just want to see justice done."
As they began the journey back to Copper Ridge, Ayanna sat quietly between the Coleman sisters, finally allowing herself to believe that freedom might be possible. But she also felt a growing concern for whoever had shot the steer. If it had been an act of mercy toward a suffering animal, that person might now face accusations of theft or worse.
The wagon bounced along the rough trail as the afternoon shadows grew longer.
Behind them, the Red Rock Canyon held its secrets close, but they had managed to uncover enough truth to change the course of Ayana's fate. The real question now was whether the town would be willing to accept evidence that contradicted their preconceived notions about Apache guilt. Emma reached over and squeezed Ayana's bound hands reassuringly. "Tomorrow will be different," she whispered. "Tomorrow they'll have to listen to the truth." But, as the wagon approached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, all four occupants wondered whether truth would be enough to overcome the prejudice and fear that had dominated the territory for so long. The evidence they had gathered was compelling, but changing minds and hearts would prove to be an even greater challenge than finding bullet holes in canyon rocks. The sun was setting behind the western mountains as they rolled into town, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded Ayana of the freedom she hoped to regain. Tomorrow's hearing would determine not just her personal fate, but whether justice was truly possible in a place where the word of an Apache woman had never been considered worth hearing. Sheriff Martinez looked at the determined faces of the Coleman sisters and realized that something significant had changed during their afternoon in the canyon. These young women had not only helped prove Ayana's innocence but had also formed bonds of understanding that crossed the racial and cultural divides that plagued the territory. Perhaps there was hope for a better future after all. As they pulled up to the jailhouse, townspeople gathered to stare at the returning group. Word would spread quickly that the sheriff had taken the Apache woman out of her cell, and speculation about their destination and discoveries would fuel conversations throughout the evening. But, for now, Ayana would spend one more night in captivity, sustained by the knowledge that 3 people believed in her innocence and had risked their own reputations to prove it. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or condemnation, but tonight she could sleep knowing that truth had at least been given a chance to speak. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Copper Ridge, with golden sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows as an even larger crowd gathered for the continuation of Ayana's hearing. Word had spread through town about the previous day's expedition to the canyon, and speculation ran wild about what evidence might have been discovered. Some residents hoped for vindication of their suspicions about Apache guilt, while others began to whisper that perhaps they had been too quick to judge. Sheriff Martinez arrived early at the courthouse, carrying a canvas bag containing the bullet casings and other evidence they had collected. He had spent much of the night reviewing his notes and considering the implications of their discoveries. As a lawman, he was committed to following evidence wherever it led, even when it challenged popular opinion. Sarah and Emma Coleman sat in their usual seats near the front, but this morning they were joined by their father, Jack Coleman. The gruff rancher had been furious when he learned of his daughter's involvement in investigating the case, but their passionate arguments about justice and their detailed account of the evidence had slowly begun to change his mind. "I still don't like you girls getting mixed up in this business," Jack grumbled as they took their seats. "But if that Apache woman is truly innocent, then someone else is responsible for the missing cattle, and I want to know who." Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with his characteristic dignity, but those who knew him well could see the intensity in his eyes. He had spent considerable time reviewing territorial law regarding evidence and testimony, preparing for what he suspected would be a more complex hearing than originally anticipated. "This court is now in session," announced Bailiff Sullivan. "We will continue with the preliminary hearing in the matter of Territory versus Ayana." Prosecutor Whitman stood at his table, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the case had taken. He had built his career on straightforward convictions and had little experience dealing with evidence that contradicted his initial assumptions. "Your Honor," Whitman began, "the prosecution maintains that the evidence against the defendant remains compelling. Regardless of where she claims to have found the meat, the fact remains that she was in possession of stolen livestock." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Whitman, before we proceed, I believe the court should hear about the investigation conducted yesterday at the location described by the defendant. Sheriff Martinez, would you please present your findings?" Martinez stood and approached the witness stand, carrying his bag of evidence. "Your Honor, yesterday afternoon I accompanied Miss Sarah Coleman, Miss Emma Coleman, and the defendant to the Red Rock Canyon approximately 15 miles southwest of the Morrison Ranch." As the sheriff began describing their discoveries, the courtroom grew completely silent. He methodically presented each piece of evidence: the bloodstains and disturbed ground where the animal had lain, the bullet gouge in the canyon wall, the firing position on the ridge, and, finally, the brass cartridge cases. Based on the physical evidence, Martinez concluded, it appears that a steer was shot in that canyon by someone firing from an elevated position. The trajectory and impact patterns are consistent with the defendant's claim that she found the animal already dead.
Prosecutor Whitman jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor.
The sheriff is not qualified to make ballistics determinations, and this evidence doesn't prove the defendant's innocence. She could have been involved in the shooting herself. But Judge Harrison was studying the brass cartridge cases that Martinez had presented. Sheriff, you said these are .44-40 Winchester cartridges.
Did you determine whether the defendant or her companions possessed firearms of this type? No, Your Honor.
When the defendant was arrested, her group had no firearms at all. According to the arresting posse, they found only traditional Apache weapons, bows, knives, and tools for gathering food. This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom. If Ayana's group had no rifles, they could not have fired the shots that killed the steer. Judge Harrison turned to the prosecutor.
Mr. Whitman, do you have any evidence that the defendant had access to a Winchester rifle on the night in question?
Whitman shuffled through his papers desperately but found nothing to support such a claim. No, Your Honor, but the defendant could have had accomplices who disposed of the weapon.
That's pure speculation, the judge replied curtly. Do you have any actual evidence of accomplices? No, Your Honor.
Emma Coleman could barely contain her excitement as she watched the prosecution's case crumble. Beside her, Ayana sat with quiet dignity, but Sarah could see the hope growing in the Apache woman's eyes. Judge Harrison called for Sarah Coleman to testify about her observations at the canyon. As the young woman approached the witness stand, her father watched with a mixture of pride and concern. He had raised his daughters to think for themselves, but he hadn't expected them to become involved in such a controversial case.
Miss Coleman, Judge Harrison began, please describe what you observed during yesterday's investigation.
Sarah spoke clearly and confidently, describing the evidence they had found and explaining how it supported Ayana's version of events. She also testified about the medicinal plants growing near the stream and the clear signs that bark had been harvested from the willow trees.
In your opinion, the judge continued, was the defendant's explanation about gathering medicinal plants consistent with what you observed? Completely consistent, Your Honor.
The plants she mentioned are exactly what my mother taught me the Apache people use for treating fevers and other illnesses. And the way the bark was harvested showed knowledge and care, taking only what was needed without damaging the trees. When Prosecutor Whitman cross-examined Sarah, he struggled to find flaws in her testimony. Her observations had been careful and detailed, and her knowledge of local plant life, inherited from her mother, gave her statements credibility. Emma was called next and provided additional details about the shooting position they had discovered. Her natural enthusiasm and obvious sincerity made a strong impression on the courtroom, and even some of the townspeople who had arrived convinced of Ayana's guilt began to look uncertain. As the morning progressed, Judge Harrison found himself facing a situation he had rarely encountered in his years on the territorial bench. The physical evidence clearly contradicted the charges against the defendant, but accepting that evidence would mean acknowledging that the local law enforcement and community leaders had been wrong in their assumptions about Apache guilt. Your Honor, Sheriff Martinez requested permission to speak again.
There's one more matter the court should consider.
Proceed, Sheriff. The brass cartridges we found are relatively fresh, probably fired within the last week or two. But, more importantly, the precision of the shooting suggests someone with considerable skill with a rifle. This wasn't random gunfire or an accidental discharge.
Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. What are you suggesting, Sheriff?
I think someone deliberately shot that steer, probably to end its suffering if it was injured or sick.
But, whoever did it chose not to claim the meat, perhaps because they didn't want to admit to destroying another rancher's property.
This explanation made sense to many people in the courtroom, including several ranchers who had faced similar situations with their own livestock. Sometimes the humane thing to do was put a suffering animal out of its misery, even if it meant losing valuable beef. Prosecutor Whitman made one last attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, even if we accept that the defendant found the animal already dead, she still committed theft by taking the meat without permission from the owner. But Judge Harrison was ready with a response. Mr. Whitman, territorial law recognizes the concept of salvage, particularly in cases involving survival necessity. If the defendant's group was facing hunger and found meat that would otherwise go to waste, the legal precedent generally favors the salvager over the original owner. The judge paused to let this sink in, then continued. Moreover, the defendant was not attempting to hide her actions. She was openly cooking the meat when the posse arrived, which is hardly the behavior of someone who believed she was committing a crime. At this point, even Prosecutor Whitman could see that his case had collapsed completely. The physical evidence, the testimony of credible witnesses, and the legal precedent all favored the defendant.
Judge Harrison looked around the packed courtroom before rendering his decision.
Based on the evidence presented to this court, I find that there is insufficient cause to proceed with criminal charges against the defendant. The physical evidence clearly supports her claim that she found the animal already dead, and there is no credible evidence that she participated in any theft. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry mutters. Some people applauded the judge's commitment to evidence over prejudice, while others grumbled about Apache lovers and bleeding heart justice. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. However, he continued, raising his voice to restore order, this case has revealed something troubling about our community. The defendant was arrested and charged based primarily on assumptions about her race and culture rather than on solid evidence. That kind of prejudice has no place in American justice. He turned to address Ayanna directly. Miss Ayanna, this court apologizes for the injustice you have suffered. You are free to go, and I hope our community can learn from this experience. Sheriff Martinez moved quickly to remove Ayanna's chains while the courtroom continued to buzz with conversation. As the shackles fell away, the Apache woman stood tall and looked around at the faces that had judged her so harshly just days before. Sarah and Emma Coleman rushed to embrace Ayanna, their faces bright with joy and relief. Their father followed more slowly, still processing the implications of what had transpired. Thank you, Ayanna said to the sisters, her voice thick with emotion. You risk much to help me. I not forget this kindness. Emma wiped tears from her eyes. We couldn't let them punish you for something you didn't do. It wouldn't have been right. As the crowd began to disperse, many townspeople approached to offer apologies or expressions of support. Mrs. Peterson, the woman who walked her dogs near the hills, confirmed that she had seen Ayanna gathering plants on the evening in question, providing additional corroboration for her story. But not everyone was pleased with the outcome. Tom Bradley and several other ranchers gathered in a tight group, their faces dark with anger and disappointment. Deputy Frank Morrison looked particularly upset, having been certain of the defendant's guilt. Sheriff Martinez noticed the hostile group and made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Some people would have difficulty accepting that they had been wrong about Ayanna, and their injured pride might lead to further problems. Jack Coleman approached Ayanna with evident discomfort, clearly struggling with years of ingrained prejudice. Miss, he said awkwardly, I owe you an apology. I was quick to believe the worst about you, and that wasn't fair. Ayanna studied the gruff rancher's face and saw genuine remorse there. You learn truth. That is good thing. Maybe other people learn too. If you ever need anything, Coleman continued, surprising himself with his sincerity, supplies, medical care for your people, anything like that, you come to me. I owe you that much. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Sarah asked Ayanna about her plans. Will you return to your camp? Are your people safe? Yes, I go back to my brother and the others. Winter comes soon, will be hard time, but we survive. We always survive. Emma impulsively hugged Ayanna again. Will we see you again? Can we visit your camp? Ayanna smiled, the first genuine smile anyone in Copper Ridge had seen from her. You always welcome. I teach you more about healing plants, you teach me more about your world. Understanding between peoples is good thing. Sheriff Martinez offered to escort Ayanna partway back to her camp, and the Coleman family volunteered to provide supplies for the journey. As they walked toward the livery stable to gather horses and provisions, other townspeople began offering food, blankets, and other necessities. The transformation was remarkable. In the space of a few hours, Ayanna had gone from being seen as a dangerous criminal to being recognized as a victim of injustice. More importantly, the community had been forced to confront its own prejudices and assumptions. As the group prepared to depart, Judge Harrison approached them one last time. "Miss Coleman, Miss Emma," he said to the sisters, "what you did took considerable courage. You risked your reputations and, possibly your safety to ensure that justice was done. That's the kind of character our territory needs if we're going to build a fair and decent society." Sarah blushed at the praise. "We just did what our mother taught us was right, Your Honor." "Then, your mother raised remarkable daughters." The ride to Ayanna's camp took several hours, winding through the beautiful but harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory. Along the way, Ayanna shared stories of her people's history and culture, while Sarah and Emma talked about their own family and their dreams for the future. Sheriff Martinez rode slightly apart, giving the women privacy for their conversation but remaining alert for any signs of trouble. He had learned much during this case about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and assumptions. When they reached the Apache camp, Ayanna's brother Nailnish rushed forward with obvious relief and joy. The reunion was emotional, with tears and laughter as Ayanna was welcomed back by her extended family. The sick child she had been seeking medicine for was recovering, but Ayanna immediately began preparing willow bark tea to help with the remaining fever. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Emma found themselves welcomed into the camp with surprising warmth. They helped prepare food, learned about traditional crafts, and played with the Apache children who were curious about these friendly white women who had helped bring their relative home. "This is how it should be," Emma said to her sister as they watched Ayanna teaching a young girl how to weave grass into baskets. "People helping each other, learning from each other, instead of fighting over differences." Sarah nodded, thinking about the courage it had taken for all of them to stand up for what was right. "Mother would be proud," she said quietly. As the sun began to set, it was time for the visitors to return to Copper Ridge. The farewells were warm and sincere, with promises to maintain the friendships that had been forged through adversity. On the ride back to town, the Coleman sisters reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. They had not only helped free an innocent woman but had also challenged their entire community to examine its prejudices and assumptions. "Do you think people will really change?" Emma asked her father. Jack Coleman considered the question carefully. "Some will, some won't. But, at least now they know it's possible. And, that's a start." Sheriff Martinez nodded agreement. "Change happens slowly out here, but it does happen. What you girls did today will be remembered and talked about for years to come. That kind of courage has a way of inspiring others." As they reached the outskirts of Copper Ridge, the lights of the town twinkled in the gathering darkness like stars scattered across the desert floor. It looked the same as it always had, but somehow everything felt different. Justice had been served, friendships had been forged across cultural divides, and a community had been forced to confront its own capacity for both prejudice and fairness. The story of Ayanna and the Coleman sisters would indeed be told for generations, becoming a legend of courage, justice, and the power of individuals to stand up for what is right. In a territory where differences often led to conflict, they had proven that understanding and compassion were possible, even in the most challenging circumstances. As they rode through the quiet streets toward home, all three reflected on the profound truth that courage comes not from the absence of fear, but from doing what is right despite that fear. They had changed not only Ayanna's fate but also the character of their community, proving that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to act with integrity and compassion. The case of the Apache woman in chains had ended, but the legacy of three brave individuals who refused to accept injustice would continue to inspire others for years to come.